So, this is a conversation with Bryan Farell. He's one of the founders of Waging Nonviolence, and he also hosts the podcast City of Refuge, the topic of this episode. City of Refuge is a 10-part series from Waging Nonviolence, which explores a little known World War II rescue story, showing what happens when ordinary people won't ignore the horror surrounding them. It is the story of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a small village which sits on a 3,000-foot high plateau in south central France. During World War II, Le Chambon's people, along with those of several surrounding villages, sheltered, fed, and protected around 5,000 refugees, including 3,500 Jews. Even more incredibly, they did this while openly rejecting Nazism, as well as its collaborators in the French Vichy regime. We spoke about the story of Le Chambon and its people and what it meant to be waging nonviolence. We argue that nonviolence should be seen as a set of actions rather than the widespread misconception portraying it as akin to doing nothing. Nonviolence is active, not passive. If you like this podcast, you can follow it on Twitter at FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for your time.
I'm Bryan Farell, and I am one of the founders and editors of WagingNonviolence.org, which is a online publication that covers social movements all around the world. And we recently, in I guess the fall, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary. So it's been around for a little while, and that's primarily what I do. But I also, for Waging Nonviolence, released a podcast series in the fall called City of Refuge, which is a 10-part series that tells the story of a kind of little known rescue operation that took place during World War II in a small French community. And it's a pretty remarkable story. So this series kind of gets into the details of how that happened and how they pulled it off.
Awesome, thanks. The series is excellent, and I highly recommend it to anyone listening to this. I will obviously link the necessary links on the website. So, can we just start with a general introduction into Le Chambon, into the series, into the city behind the podcast?
Yeah. So Le Chambon is a small village on a plateau in southwest or south central, excuse me, France. Um, and I didn't really know what a plateau was until hearing about this story. But they use the term quite a bit. I guess it's a French word, so that might make sense. But it's basically a mountain community. So it's a little isolated. And on this plateau, there are, I think, 12 villages, 13 including Le Chambon. And it basically was, well, it's, I'll start by kind of looking at its kind of older history. It became sort of a place of refuge for Protestants. I think during the sort of persecutions that happened in the 14 and 1500s in France, because it was this remote place. It was a good place to kind of escape the violence that was being perpetrated against Protestants, and it was a sort of a safe haven. Um, and it kind of remained that way, this sort of distant place, a little separate from the rest of France. And by the 20th century, it was just a kind of a farming community, pretty rural, pretty poor. Um, and while I think 99% of France is Catholic, Le Chambon, in particular, was almost all Protestant. There were other religious sects on the plateau, including Catholics, but even some um, uh, basically, I guess I'm forgetting what they're called, but we might in America kind of think of them as like Amish people, very sort of Old Testament, but but Christian and kind of conservative in their approach to the world. Kind of just a unique place, I guess, in France. And um, basically, where this story starts is that a pastor and his wife moved to Le Chambon. Um, the pastor and his wife, their names were Magda and Andre Trocme, and they were two pretty incredible people. They Andre was born in France to a kind of well-off family in northern France, and Magda was born in Italy. Uh, they met in the 1920s as college students in New York City. They were both going to Columbia University, and they soon married, moved back to France. Andre became a pastor in some of the industrialized northern cities in France because he had a real passion for um, social justice issues and also um, wanting to work with the worker communities that were in these industrialized cities. And his kind of radical politics did not jive well with the Protestant church. And by the late 1930s, he was kind of out of a job, and he had this one offer essentially to go to this, godforsaken plateau. And sort of like let's get rid of this guy by putting him out to pasture, so to speak, in this place. And so he went there, and I think well, I guess he moved there. I think it was the mid 1930s with Magda, and they had a couple children at this point. And at first, they were kind of disappointed. They thought this was going to be a pretty boring place to have a ministry because, again, he was really interested in a vibrancy of the cities, of dealing with poverty and other labor issues, and didn't seem like there'd be much opportunity for that in this very rural, quiet place. But he pretty quickly took to the community, kind of realizing that it had this unique history, this sort of outsider perspective on things, because they were these, the descendants of the French Huguenots who were persecuted by the Catholics, and they had this real sense of resistance, um, and so he was intrigued by that and saw opportunities there. And as the 30s kind of came to a close and Hitler was on the rise, um, he and his assistant pastor, a man named Edouard Tace, they founded a school, an international school in Le Chambon. Um, and it was called the Sevenol School, and it was kind of founded on the ideals of nonviolence and internationalism, and they were just really ahead of their time. This community was so ready to be outspoken against fascism that was rising in Europe, and prepared. And so essentially, when the war came to France, that's exactly what happened. They were prepared to deal, in a sense, with what was coming to their country in a way that basically the rest of France was not. Um, the rest of France, as most people know, they lost pretty quickly in a war to the Germans. France was then split in two. The northern half of France was occupied by the Nazis. The southern half, where Le Chambon was considered the free zone, but uh, it really had its own French fascist kind of government called the Vichy. And eventually, by the end of the war, the Germans had taken over the whole country. But in Le Chambon, they were kind of ready to resist from the beginning, and that's sort of where the story uh, begins, more or less.
Like, the story of Le Chambon is obviously an example of waging nonviolence, by which I mean it kind of complicates the idea that nonviolence is this passive thing, which I feel is a widespread idea, even though even we can find videos of Martin Luther King talking about why there's a difference between nonviolence and passivity or indifference, for example, because there is this weird misconception, I guess, about nonviolence, about how nonviolence is supposed to be this thing that is contrasted with obviously with violence, and violence is an action, is something that one does, and therefore non-violence is something that one doesn't do. uh,
Yeah.
can you talk a bit about waging nonviolence, the website itself, and the concept of waging nonviolence, and how well it's been 10 years now that you said, how have you seen this idea kind of develop over the past decade?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to say that by and large, the conception of nonviolence is kind of a very passive um, approach to uh, if 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 you would even call it resistance, sort of, it's very much coupled with the idea of turning the other cheek, which is I could go on in a different direction on that. Some uh, nonviolence advocates who've really studied the New Testament will actually tell you that we don't really understand the concept of turning the other cheek. That we'd take it to mean just like give me more. I won't hit you back. I'm not going to do anything. And really, in the context of the Bible, and I guess of uh, of the Hebrew culture at that time, it was an insult to turn your other cheek, and that there was this kind of active resistance component to it. And so I think advocates of nonviolence have been fighting that perception for a long time, that nonviolence is just strictly passive. Um, that and I think what we try to do with waging nonviolence, even with our name, is trying to underscore the active component of it. And um, I think we've done a good job of that. I think that we've published hundreds of stories over the decade we've been running the site, and I think um, I think one of the things we're kind of proud of is that we tried to make this approach to storytelling, this idea that we're going to focus on um, stories of active nonviolent resistance. Uh, we made it something I think that could be um, embraced by just about anybody interested in the issues. And I think that's been a problem for nonviolence advocates for a long time, is that they don't know how to essentially advocate for their position in a way, and become siloed off from, I think, other parts of the movement. And so I would venture to guess that most people that have written for Waging Nonviolence aren't like ideologically like pacifists, hardline nonviolence advocates. It just happens to line up um, with the type of resistance that is going on and at the moment and what they're covering. And I think that's been an important aspect of what we've done with the site, and just trying to dispel this idea that nonviolence isn't active, um, because I think that happens as a result of two things. One, you know, and it's usually through co-optation. You'll oftentimes hear uh, like the police or the state in some ways use the term, nonviolence. Like we'd like to see, if there's like say a riot that happens after some horrible incident, say of police violence, and I think this happened a few years ago in Baltimore, and I think the mayor of Baltimore was like calling on the people of Baltimore to use nonviolence, and it's like coming from the state, like you know they don't know what they're talking about. If they wouldn't want to see they wouldn't want to see nonviolence if they really understood what it meant. And I think uh, other people take that cue and they think, well, if the state is calling for nonviolence, then it must not be a very powerful thing. And of course, it isn't so much as the conception of what nonviolence is to the state. And then you also just have, I think, a lot of more kind of mainstream liberals who again also don't understand what nonviolence is, and want some kind of watered down type of resistance. And we're not really just talking about the same thing, I think. So that's the struggle, I think, with running our publication, is trying to really show what active nonviolence is. And that's why I was definitely drawn to the story of Le Chambon. And it was one of the first stories I heard when I was learning about nonviolence that I think helped me understand what it was about and drew me to it. So I wanted to tell it myself, in the hopes that maybe it would help others understand what nonviolence really is and what it's about and capable of doing.
Mm. And from what I understand, Le Chambon continues to sort of welcome refugees today.
That's right. Yeah, that was something I learned um, actually kind of after I started releasing episodes for the series. I live in New York, and um, although I run this small nonprofit news organization, it's not very well funded, and so I didn't have much resources in terms of being able to travel. So I never traveled to Le Chambon. I also thought, well, what is the point? Like I'm trying to tell a story from 75 years ago. It just didn't occur to me that that there might be something relevant happening there today. But as it happens, a new book came out around the same time as I released the series that is called The Plateau. And it is about this place today. The author, Maggie Paxson, is a social scientist who went there and sort of studied how this community has continued to help refugees. They have refugee centers there, but also when the government has made even its legal system of refugee acceptance untenable, the people of Le Chambon have uh, brought folks into their homes and taken on greater risks as they always had. And it's not surprising because, as I mentioned, it just has this long history of it going back, uh, to the French Huguenots of the 14 and 1500s. Then you have World War II, and you have now this or sadly now not new, but about almost 10-year long new refugee crisis happening. And they're just, it shouldn't be surprising that this kind of approach is really baked into their whole the whole way they operate and live.
And the scholar you mentioned, I know that you mentioned her again in the podcast. Can you talk to a bit about that book? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was the one who said something along the lines of she wanted to study peace because there was already too much being done on studying violence and war. Was that her?
Yeah, I actually only interviewed her in the most recent episode. I've been releasing a few bonus ones, and this came out last week. So you must have just heard it. Yeah, Maggie Paxson, who wrote this new book on Le Chambon, um, she uh, she decided to do this because she, as a social scientist, had been really focused on studying communities that were ravaged by war. She lived for a couple years in the Caucasus, in Chechnya, and I think just got really bogged down by by focusing on uh, uh, this particular storyline, and she wondered, you know, is there why doesn't anyone study peace exactly in this sense? Like, what can we learn? Are there peaceful communities? Like, we're learning from communities ravaged by war. Why can't we learn um, about communities that have some kind of remarkable propensity for peace? And that led her to Le Chambon and um, to study that very point.
That last part is very important because there is also this tendency, and I have it within me. It's not like I've completely uh, deconstructed it all or gotten rid of it myself. But whenever when the reason why we study communities ravaged by war is because war also provides so much content at the end of the day. And there is, in so the contrast to that, there is this widespread perception that, well, peace isn't as interesting. It doesn't provide as much
Mhm.
because I think, and I'm wondering if you would agree with this, but I think that studying communities that have some kind of propensity for peace, as you mentioned. Like let's say studying Le Chambon, if we reach conclusions that don't fit our preconceptions of what human nature is supposedly about, this myth that we're all supposed to just be, you know, um, that what was that quote by Maggie Thatcher? Like, there's no society, there's no individual or something.
There's no
There's no
alternative.
alternative
Yeah.
essentially, and when we find these alternatives, it's either it's like part of us doesn't actually believe they exist, or part of us believe that well, at some point something is gonna ruin that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sorry.
Absolutely. No, go ahead.
No, and I've struggled with this question myself. As I said, I don't really have answers, and part of why we're having this conversation is to just kind of think out loud. Um, when it comes to nonviolence, the two cases that I know the most are Lebanon and Syria. And
Mm.
in Lebanon, the vast majority of protesters in the past few years have been nonviolent, and not just because people quote unquote don't want to be violent. I mean, at some point, if conditions are desperate enough, which they are becoming, are turning out to be in Lebanon these days, we will see
Mm-hmm.
riots, and they will be understandable, and there will be at some point a way of understanding that for a segment of the population, in any case, especially the most vulnerable and the most desperate, this might be their only outlet right now. This might be the only thing that they feel might get the attention of the media and of politicians. And for me personally, saying that I would still rather see what are the options for, let's use the term the website, for waging non-violence, to use a more active verb, of course, which is the point of the website, does not mean that I do not understand why they are angry or why they are violent, and it does not mean that I will condemn them for being violent. And here, when I say violence, they're not attacking people. Even they're, you know, destroying banks and throwing stuff at government buildings and that kind of stuff, like symbols of the state, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I've struggled with personally, because I feel like the misconception, as we said before, of nonviolence is basically like don't do anything, like just be there,
Right.
uh, wait, yeah,
Take a
take a
beating
beating
and do
and hope for the
nothing.
best,
Yeah.
and it's just not the case, and I know that it's not the case because I'm trying to study some of these theories. I obviously Martin Luther King's speeches are I guess the most well known ones in that realm, but how, like, okay, maybe this is a repetition of the previous question, but how, when you do get these questions, or when you do get these, let's say, when you are faced with this skepticism, how do you react? Do you have like examples at hand, because it's been a decade now and so you have so many examples to give? Is it like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. A few things. First, I think it's so important. First off, to acknowledge an understanding for why people might resort to violence. I think there's a perception that if you're kind of coming from the nonviolence perspective, you're here to judge. You're here to tell people how they should resist. And I'm sure there are. I mean, I know there are people that might do that, but I don't think that's effective. And it's not honest, because it is completely understandable why sometimes people resort to violence. Like you mentioned, rioting, and I think of um, a Martin Luther King quote that riots are the language of the unheard. I mean, this was a man who devoted his life to nonviolence, but he fully understood where people were coming from. And I think, he saw it, and other organizers that really understand the dynamics of nonviolence and what's happening. uh for them, it's a battle of education. It's a battle of, like, training people to learn how to fight in a way that uh is successful. That's a key part of the nonviolence, I think, argument, because we can talk about ideologically why we might align with nonviolence. For me, uh, I do like it is an ideological perspective for me, because I really believe that means and ends need to be in sync. I don't believe the ends justify the means always. Um, but I think a better quote actually on that is Audre Lorde, who said, we, uh, what is it? The you know, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Um, you know that, a- and that's not to say that sometimes it won't work. You know, sometimes you can beat them at their own game using violence, but that certainly becomes harder and harder, especially if you're facing off against a state with, unending resources to pour into weapons and violence. That ultimately the way to bring about real change is going to be through a different method, one that is aligned with the kind of just society we want. So that's just speaking to the ideological perspective, and that I think is helpful, but only to a point. As I said, I think uh, because so many people that read or even write for Waging Nonviolence don't necessarily share our ideological perspective. What I think draws people in is the notion of effectiveness, right? Like what's what how do movements succeed? And I think the best resource on this, I don't know if you've heard of it, is a study, but ultimately was turned into a book uh, called Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth um, and Maria Steffen. It's a really incredible study. Uh, they're political scientists, or at least Erica Chenoweth is a political scientist who she actually her background was that she studied political violence, that she actually didn't believe uh, nonviolence was effective, um, and was challenged, I believe, by her co-author, or who became her co-author, Maria Steffen, to look into that, to see. She's like, you're a scientist. Get the data. Let's look into it. Let's figure this out. And so she did. And they, I think, looked at over 300 cases of violent and nonviolent movements over 100 years. I think the study was mainly looking at the 20th century. It may have gone into the 21st a little bit. The book came out, I think, in 2010. Anyway, basically looked at every major movement of the past century, and the data showed that nonviolent movements succeeded twice as often as violent movements. um, and I think that's important to know. I think, like, before this study, we hunched that maybe nonviolence was effective. Those who studied it, but there was, no way to know. And I think that's pretty key to people's understanding of nonviolence. And it has a lot to do with uh, the dynamics that are at play. Why does nonviolence succeed more often? Well, her answer, Erica Chenoweth, the author of this study, her answer was numbers, right? You can have more people participate in a nonviolent movement, you know, than a violent one, because violent movements tend to, fall on to usually a category of young men. Um, not entirely, but mostly. Whereas nonviolent movements can include everyone. In Le Chambon, it was everyone in this community, and mainly the leaders were women. They were the kind of heads of the household, so to speak, like these women who ran their homes um, and were bringing in the refugees, coordinating with each other, figuring out where to hide them, where to put them, how to handle this whole thing, and children too. Children were a big part of the movement in Le Chambon. So numbers matter. Numbers correlate with victory and correlate with nonviolence. And so I think, that's sort of my long-winded answer to your question of, like, what to tell people if they're trying to understand nonviolence, or why nonviolence. Why should I be considering this approach to resistance? I think that's, like, kind of the way to look at it. Both, you can talk about the ideology, but it always, for me, kind of comes down to practicality, and what kind of, like, change we are going to achieve. Is it going to be a just change that's in line with with our beliefs and goals, or is it a change that is predicated on a supposedly temporary use of violence that somehow will just stop? once we achieve our goal, and I think there aren't many examples of that happening, I think.
So just to go back to Le Chambon, I'm trying to wonder. It was kind of this question throughout the podcast while I was listening to it, and you do kind of answer it as well, actually. Um, well, not kinda, you do answer it, but can we talk a bit about what is it about? So if we take Le Chambon as like we wanna try and understand this place, and we wanna sort of like, I don't know, draw let's say bullet points of what are the characteristics of a village like Le Chambon that would be willing to do something like this against the norm, against what would couldn't be considered legal at the time, because it was illegal to help Jews, obviously, during the German
Mhm.
occupation and the Vichy regime. My sense is that one of the prerequisites is not just a love for humanity, which can be, as we said, like kind of fostered. So it's something that can be passed down in generation, and especially if a village like Le Chambon has this identity of being themselves, coming from a persecuted past, then this might facilitate this kind of response. And indeed, I mean, we have seen this in the Middle East as well. There have been cases, for example, Iraqi Kurds, welcoming Syrian Kurds during the ISIS offensive, or border areas between Lebanon and Syria welcoming Syrian refugees fleeing the Assad regime, or that kind of thing. So there's usually something that connects them. Either it's in their own past, or maybe there are familial links, ethnic links, whatever. So those are part of the
Yeah.
story. But another part of it is that, from what the sense that I got about Le Chambon, is that they're also comfortable in their own identity, in the sense that this is where they are. There's a very kind of I hesitate to say nature-based identity, but they identify very strongly with their surroundings, where they are, le plateau, like the location of where they are is actually very important, and this sort of anchors them in a certain way to help others. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Yep. That's very true.
And yeah, so I've been wondering about that, because one of the things that um, I've been trying to think a lot about the question of the EU's horrific response to the so-called refugee crisis in recent years, which I try to just call a European crisis, because it sort of feels like it's an identity crisis from within, rather than so one of the reasons why I try and say so-called refugee crisis, just to kind of complicate it a bit, so that it doesn't seem like it's just all about the refugees and essentially it's their fault, which some people can
Right.
think that
Yeah.
way. And I wrote this essay just like just a week before the pandemic was declared, which feels like 10 years ago now, but um, essentially saying like the European Union and Fortress Europe cannot coexist. And the idea, so the general gist of that piece is that the EU is supposedly built on this idea of internal mobility, and freedom of movement is supposedly part of it. But an inherent contradiction in this entire idea, obviously, is that they can be very flexible on freedom of movement within the wider borders, but when it comes to the actual borders of the EU, that's when things can get very violent, as we've seen time and time again recently. One of the conclusions that I've been reaching, and let's call it maybe a potentially temporary conclusion, if until I find a better one, but that part of the reason why there's so much fear and hatred within the EU's borders, not everyone obviously, but it's hegemonized at this point. It's kind of taken for granted that the people coming from abroad, that there's something wrong with this whole story, in that to be quote unquote moderate is to at least concede some kind of ground to the far, essentially what is the far right's narratives when it comes to refugees. And the best example for that is, I forgot her name, Ursula von der Leyen. I think she's one of the heads of the EU, essentially like a few years ago condemning Viktor Orban's rhetoric against migrants, but then recently, just like 3 months ago, basically echoing almost exactly what he said. And sort of like this becomes the new center. And so one of the things that I'm trying to see, if you want, and you can just see, because I'm myself a migrant in the EU, so in some ways it affects me personally, although I'm
Mhm.
not in remotely as vulnerable positions as these refugees and these migrants are. But there is a sense, when from within the EU, the sense that I've had being in the UK and now in Switzerland, and often going to France as well, and Italy for that matter, is that the hatred against the other, the hatred against these refugees, the fear of these refugees, some like a part of me feels that there's a lot of projection happening. There's a lot of we personally, we the Europeans feel like there's something unstable about our lives, like we're becoming the precariat, as Zygmunt Bauman called it, and that these people coming over from over there, these Syrians and Afghans and various African nationalities and Iraqis and so on, they actually look like us quite a lot in the sense of like they have quote unquote normal jobs. They don't fit into the stereotype that we might have about quote unquote the rest of the world, and that it's that's actually being how do you say this? That is what is being challenged here by the presence of these quote unquote these others. Whereas with Le Chambon, from what I could tell, they were comfortable about who they are. They were comfortable about the history that they've had, especially because obviously, or I would assume so, like since what they have done during the Holocaust, during the Nazi occupation, and the Vichy occupation, since that has sort of came out, that has become part of their identity now, and they can basically replicate what they did a few decades ago. And obviously, those are not the same people. We're talking about like the grandchildren of those people. They can
Mhm.
replicate it because there's already this legacy happening. And so I guess my question was kind of like this open note, so like feel free to respond however you want. I'm trying to I always try and wonder like what is it about us? So like a lot of the, as you said, like a lot of the issues when we talk about the quote unquote refugee crisis is that we tend to just project the issues on them. Like there's something wrong about them. They need to better integrate. They need to learn the language. They need everything. It's on them. But what about us? Like
Mhm.
if there's something, if we're not able to welcome people who are very visibly desperately fleeing, then there's something wrong from within. There's something wrong from within our so-called communities, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think the way we often understand it here, in the U.S., like this antagonism is and it's kind of really nonsensical, but there's this notion of like refugees, or not refugees, just migrants in general, are taking our jobs, um, and of course it's not really true. In the US, most, I think, uh, most migrants are taking jobs that Americans won't do, like working in the fields, picking crops and things like that. But uh, even though it's kind of an illogical argument, I guess it taps into this kind of feeling, that is legitimate, which is that, um, you know, for so many Americans, working class and poor, there's no safety net. There's nothing there. There's no resources are scant. Jobs might be as well. And uh, you know, when you're in this kind of a situation, you can go, I guess, one of two ways. One is unfortunately the way we have gone, which is that we find a scapegoat, to blame for why we're suffering, why we're not having a better life. Um, and that's always exploited by the right, and not really, you know, defended against much by, um, what stands as the, you know, left in American politics, which is really a center right to begin with. Um, so I imagine that's the same in Europe as well, and that was sort of my understanding from Maggie Paxson, the social scientist who studied Le Chambon today, where she was saying, it's not that like everyone in Le Chambon is perfect or has, nothing but good things to say about refugees. Individuals might differ, but by and large, the community as a whole is pretty exemplary. And then in the rest of France, that's not the case. And she was saying, when in times of you know when times are tough, say follow like the 2008 financial crisis, resources are harder to reach. Yeah, people grab for straws and try to blame the other and don't seem to realize that, you know, uh, we should be fighting together for what we all deserve, you know. And that's, I guess, the job of like movements or other institutions that can take the charge, you know. And in Le Chambon, that was the the religious community, but it doesn't have to be a religious community. It could be some other kind of institution that is there to help guide the way toward, um, you know, with the basic uh, notion that Martin Luther King forwarded, you know, the beloved community, this idea that, you know, I'm not free until we're all free. Why we can't take that perspective uh, when times are tough? Like you know, that's, I think, one of our biggest hurdles to overcome. Um, and it's unfortunate that usually it seems the right is best able to exploit the you know, the economic hardships that many people suffer through, and you know, uh, galvanize forces in the wrong direction. So I guess that's my kind of my sort of crude understanding of the dynamic
No, that
there.
makes sense. That makes sense. If that's okay with you, can I squeeze an extra question?
Oh, definitely.
So
Yeah.
you, one of the most recent episodes is on one of my favorite writers, Albert Camus. Can you talk a bit about his relationship to the whole story of the City of Refuge?
Definitely, yeah. He, you know, he was an interesting side note to the whole story. And I didn't, and because he was a side note, I didn't really include it in the initial 10 episode series. I always thought, well, you know, I can do a bonus episode on him, and then of course the virus hit, and it was like, okay, well then this is the time to talk about Camus because he wrote The Plague while he was living on the plateau. So suddenly it became a little less of a side note, but basically, he um, he moved to the plateau, I think in, I'm not going to probably get the dates right, but I think it was 41. So France was already divided, and uh, he had tuberculosis, and his doctor recommended that he go somewhere up in the mountains, and his wife actually knew about the plateau in south central France, and recommended they go there. So they moved there, and they were there for like a summer together, and then his wife went back to Algeria because she was teaching, and the plan was that he would spend the winter in Le Chambon, or it's really a village next to it, and um, things got bad pretty quickly. Not long after his wife left was when the Allied forces invaded North Africa, which then led the Germans to, you know, end the sort of sham, uh, you know, free zone in France and just take it all over. So suddenly the Germans were occupying all of France, and Camus was stuck there. And as he put it in his journals, like rats, trapped like rats. And so he couldn't go back to Algeria to be with his wife, and so he kind of made the best of it. He already had this idea for the plague, and he was kind of, you know, he had a small circle of friends there. One of whom was this, I guess, well regarded uh, French Algerian Jew named Andre Chouraki, and he was like a biblical scholar, and so he kind of talked to Camus about, you know, the biblical histories of plagues. But then, as it happened, this 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 man Shoraki was also involved in the resistance effort on the plateau. He was part of a network that was helping get Jewish children out of the internment camps in France and placed in Le Chambon. And this was sort of an underground network that was exploiting a weakness in the internment camp system. And so that's how Camus learned about this resistance that was happening on the plateau. And at the same time, um, there was also an armed resistance, what is best known today, the French resistance, um, which didn't really spring up until after the Germans fully took over France. So for like 2 years, the nonviolent resistance was happening on the plateau, and nothing else really happening in France. Then this armed portion kind of starts to gain some momentum, and it's really because uh, the Germans had taken over all of France and were trying to recruit, basically like force force forcefully enlist French young men into German labor. And so all these resistors kind of fled and hid in places like the plateau, and kind of got involved in guerrilla um, warfare. Or, I mean, that's kind of maybe giving it more credit than it deserved. It really didn't amount to very much. But in any case, uh, Camus was sort of aware of these two strands of resistance that were happening on the plateau, and kind of mirrored them in the novel that he ended up then writing about the plague, which is an allegory for the occupation of France, and sort of how do you fight fascism? How do you what's the best way to resist? And um, I think like he kind of in a way, the way I read it is he's kind of in a sense championing the nonviolent resistance, which was about saving lives. You know, that's what they were focused on. Obviously, the people in Le Chambon and the plateau, they weren't going to defeat the Nazis militarily. I mean, one small plateau of several villages isn't going to conquer this military power. But what they were doing, which the Allies weren't, was they were directly resisting the Nazi agenda. They were directly trying to save Jewish lives, trying to save refugee lives, and they succeeded at it. And that's what Camus is sort of writing about in The Plague. He's talking about kind of the ultimate goal being to save lives. And so I thought that was interesting, and yeah, did a little bonus episode about that.
Amazing. Bryan, thank you a lot for your time.
Absolutely. It was a real pleasure to speak with you, and thanks for letting your listeners know about City of Refuge.